Welcome to the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecology Oral History Project. Today we are very fortunate to have with us Lord Narendra Patel, a very prominent obstetrician gynecologist from the United Kingdom. Naren, welcome and thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure.
What I would like to do is, just so that our viewers will have a little bit of understanding of you and your background, tell us, where were you born?
I was born in a little place that nobody ever heard of called Dundee in Tanzania, which is in southern part of Tanzania. My parents had emigrated to Tanzania, which was then called Tanganyika, because my father his education ended when he was about 12 years old, because his father died. So he was helped by some people, I presume they were relatives, to go to Africa and that way find jobs. And I was born in this little place, southern Tanzania, many moons ago.
Now, did you go to public school or private school in your early education?
Well, my schooling has always been a bit checkered and interesting for some people. My parents went to India to see his mother and my mother's side, my grandparents. At that time, I was about 4.5 years old, and they decided to leave me in India at a school which was an English school, but a Roman Catholic English school. So the education was provided mostly by teachers, male teachers, who were called brothers. But there weren't that many Roman Catholic Indian students, except 2 or 3 of us, who, when the rest of the school went to church, we went for sports, but the sports was only between 3 people. That was my first school. That taught me English. And then I left just after India became independent in 1947, and went back to a school in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, where my parents had moved to, which is the capital city of Tanzania. And I went to school there. Surprisingly, schools in those days, even in British territorial countries as opposed to colonies, were segregated on the lines of black Africans, Asians, and Europeans. So if you were an Indian, you went to an Indian school, as my genes are Indian. If you were a black African, you went to black African school. The school that I went to still exists. It's a bit run down. The glass is broken on the windows, but it still exists. It is no longer called an Indian school, and of course it's no longer segregated. The third school I went to was outside London, called Harrow High School, which was a public school. So I never actually went to any private schools, although some of them were run on a private basis. And the school in London was what you would call here qualifying to go to college. In the British system, you finish school at a certain stage, and then you go to what you call college, we call university. And I left there to go to university in Scotland. I went to St Andrews University, which just 3 months ago celebrated its 600th year as being as a university. And that's where I graduated from medical school.
I understand you also, when you graduated from that, did you go back to India at any time for?
No, I did not. I did not go back to India or Africa to practice. I did all my training as a junior resident, as a staff, as a professor, all in one place, except I did come to experience United States. And I spent a year at University of Gainesville in Florida in 1973.
Was that primarily a research year or a clinical year?
It was mostly research and a little bit of clinical. But what it gave me afterwards was March of Dimes supported me through a grant to come and do research in collaboration with OBGYN person who came from Vermont, James F. Klepp III, that some people would certainly remember because he was a character. And most important person I worked with, of course, was Donald Barron, who had moved after he retired from Yale to Gainesville, Florida. Actually, that year in the United States is what set my career path, not only in obstetrics gynecology, which I had already started, but in research aspects of obstetrics gynecology. That's how I came to know most of the senior members of OBGYN now in the United States. And in a way, that was a very productive years, because not only it set me on my research career path, but for the first time, I think in obstetrics, we were beginning to try to understand that we need to get to the fetus. Before that, it was all maternal. We had no access to the fetus. And so those 30 years after that, which were my active career years, we had all the things that developed, and my association with all the people who developed these things, such as ultrasound, such as amniocentesis, such as chorion-villus sampling, such as fetal heart monitoring. And that's how I got to know all the people, and rhesus disease, managing the rhesus disease, Ed Horn and Quilligan and Jack Pritchett.
Who were some of the people that were in Florida with you at that time? I understand there was a group of you there.
That's right. There was, University of Dundee had established a sort of a continuous chain of people who came from Dundee University to Gainesville to study different aspects of research in reproductive physiology. But my main association was with Don Barron at the time, and of course Louis Curette, and I teased Louis Curette that I had to wash up all his dirty utensils that he had left behind, because I followed him, and I could still had in the laboratory with his name on, flasks and different equipment, and I tease him still. I know he's getting an award at this meeting, and I saw him the other day, and I teased him about, I washed up your dirty washings.
Yes, he's actually, we do have an oral history with him.
Yeah. And Harry Prestowski was the chairman to start with, and then of course several others came in. And I formed a strong relationship with Jack Pritchett in Dallas, which lasted a very long time, because every year before the Society of Gynecological Investigation meeting, I used to go to Dallas for 2 weeks nearly, and Leon Chesley would come at the same time, and we became good friends. And we used to go through all the presentations from Dallas that we're going to present at SGI to say what was wrong with them, or how could they be improved. So that was a great privilege to do that. So it was and then I, of course, during my career, visited lots of OBGYN departments, either as doing grand rounds or whatever.
Well, let's go back to the time when you were a registrar. And tell me about the training that you received there in London, because you have a different system than we have in the U.S.
Yes, our system is that you do, after you come out of med school, you do, in my days, you do about 2 to 3 years, depending upon your patronage, to speak, before you move on to the next stage, which was what was called the registrar. And you might do that for about 4 more years, during which time you have to get a membership or examination of our Royal College. You cannot move out of that grade unless you first of all have a qualification as an obstetrician gynecologist. But that only allowed you to move to the next level, which was called the senior registrar. And in my days, people could remain senior registrars for 4 or 5 years before they might be eligible for what I was now called a faculty appointment, a consultant. I was lucky because I never moved, and I had a good head of the department and chief who was always keen to look after my interest. So I had gone from med school to being a consultant in just over 10 years.
That seems rather fast in that system.
Well, it was the faster end, but it wasn't unusual, so we say.
I understand you met another registrar during that period of time. that has remained with you for a number of years?
No, my wife you're talking about, I think. She was 3 years below me at the medical school. Whilst I was aware of her, I hadn't really been in contact with her, till she came to do a junior job to a registrar. So she was actually my junior. She will tell you, and I'm sure she probably has already told you, that she found me a bit more aggressive in my teaching methods, because my method was, I teach you once, you need to remember that. Don't keep teaching you many times over. And she felt that I was, therefore she preferred to work with the other registrar, who was much gentler and kinder. We're good friends with him. Anyway, she married me, so I guess it was...
I guess she did find something.
And we've been married 44 years this year, so...
Yes. Of course, as you know, your wife and my wife are very close friends.
They are,
just as we all are.
This morning.
Let me go back to your career. After the time when you reached the senior registrar, where were you sent to practice?
No, I never left Dundee. Apart from spending that year in United States, before I started OBGYN training, I had spent a year doing surgery as far away from Dundee as you can get, if you know the geography of United Kingdom, a place called Penzance, which is right at the tip on the southwest of England. And I'd done surgery there for a year. That was before I started OB training. After that, I never left Dundee. All my positions were in Dundee, right up from student to junior, to faculty, to professor. And now, of course, I'm Chancellor of University of Dundee.
That's what I was going to bring up next, that
Right.
you have really been an integral part of the school there at Dundee for many, many years. Now tell me about your involvement in the Royal College.
Well, it was interesting. The Queen's gynecologist was an incredibly nice man and a perfect gentleman called Sir George Pinker, who became the president of the college. He came to examine students, medical students. It is a tradition in the United Kingdom at one time that all universities, for the students' examination, the finals examination of medical students, will always get external examiners. And George Pinker was asked, who was then the treasurer of the Royal College of Obstetricians. And he asked my chief, I was organizing, because I was a junior doctor then, junior resident, organizing the patients for the examination for the students. But George Pinker asked my chief, why is it that Naren refuses to pay the college dues? And he said, I didn't know he was refusing to pay, but I'll ask him. So he asked me, and I said, because they do nothing for me. And George Pinker, being a nice man, said, well, you know, I hear you don't feel we do much for you. And I said, that's correct, I have no connection with you. He said, well, the only way would be then to get involved with us. Why don't you stand for council or some committees? And I said, oh. Then I got a letter from him asking if the college would welcome if I would join, and I still remember, it was then called the Statistics and Epidemiology Committee. So I thought, okay, I'll join it. And that started my involvement with the college, and subsequently I was in the council for 6 years, then I did honorary secretary for 5 years, then I was vice president for 3 years, and I was president for 3 years.
Yes, I remember when you were president. But you were also very involved with Figo.
Well, the Figo was slightly automatic because as a college you had a representation, as United Kingdom, as was the case with United States, always had a representation on the Figo executive board. I think history was that they were two of the key founders of Figo probably at one time, apart from Germany and other countries. So because I was associated with the college, I became the college's representative on Figo. And then I remained so for some time before I became the vice president of Figo. And then my interest changed in Figo terms, apart from you and I, both involved in making sure that their congresses were profitable, which they were not before, as you know. I got interested in, and that's an interesting story how I got interested, about caring for women who have obstetric fistulas, and I still do that in establishing training and centers for treatment of women with obstetric fistula, mostly in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, but in other parts too. So that was my involvement with Figo, and currently it is basically a fistula.
And I think we first met and really became friends in Figo's meeting in Montreal.
Well, I think we did because we had a common ground, or shall we say, a common feeling, because we both found executive board meetings of Figo totally disorganized shambles.
You're being very polite.
Well, I'm being direct, I think. And it needed to change and become more businesslike and have some kind of real governance structure. But the makeup of, as you well know, Figo Executive Board is such that these things are difficult for them to accept. But that's how we got together and said we could join forces to try and change this organization.
And I think we succeeded somewhat. But
yes, I think it's a better organization for that now, and it now has a chief executive which it never had, and it has identified a purpose. And in my view, although it has identified a purpose, it is not that good at executing that purpose.
Unfortunately, that's true. Let me go back to you and your career, though. You became, after your time as the president of the Royal College, you were given knighthood. You became Sir Naren.
Yes. During my presidency, first of all, two things had happened. I had followed a president who had to resign his presidency because he had put his name to a paper that was a forgery. And therefore, not only he himself, but I think the institution was affected by the disgrace that brought. He's still alive, he's a very nice man, but that ruined his career.
He's also an honorary member of ACOG.
Right. So, but it ruined his career. And I felt that the institution was more important than any one of us, and its reputation had to be harnessed back again so that it could have the influence in women's health issues. So I chose to follow a path of engaging more with the politicians and engaging with them in a more positive way rather than either criticizing them or be demanding of them. That was a stroke of luck because the government changed from conservative government to Labour government, and because I had engaged with both sides, the Labour, on coming to power, felt that they had in medicine they had somebody they could openly talk with, and the Secretary of State for Health became quite a good friend. But the other advantage at the time was that I was also elected as chairman of all the Royal Colleges. It's called the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, and I was the chairman of that. And maybe that, or whatever other reason that I do not know about, I was given a knighthood, yes, when I was still a president, which is rather earlier than you normally would have been.
And then you have used that to do more things. You've been very influential in...
Well, no, what happened was, just as I was finishing my presidency, I had written a paper as chairman of the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges that what we needed in United Kingdom was to have a national organization called National Institute of Clinical Effectiveness, called NICE. And I wrote a paper that I gave it to the minister, who accepted it and felt that they would bring a legislation to establish that, which they did 2 years later, in '99. I finished presidency in September '98, and I got a call from him to ask me to become the chairman of the National Institute of Clinical Excellence. They changed the name to, from Effectiveness. And I turned it down because I said, I got to go back to university, I'm not retired yet, and I have to get my reins back again, and I don't want to spend 4 days in London. He said, you won't, but I turned it down. But part of it was that the Scottish government had already offered me to establish, through legislation, a new institute called Clinical Standards Board, to establish clinical standards in whole of medicine in Scotland, and had given me a carte blanche to say the legislation will be one line to give you the authority to do this. That's all the legislation will say. And that's what the legislation did say. So I'd taken that job. But unknown to me, 2 months later, I got a call to say that the Queen wanted, it was the Queen's wish to make me, and the correct word used is a Baron of United Kingdom. And I discovered that that meant that I would go to the House of Lords as an independent member of the House of Lords, which is what I've now done for the last 15 years.
And in that, you've had some interesting responsibilities, both for healthcare and otherwise.
Yes, I then did what was called the Health Improvement Scotland, to actually not only define the standards of practice and outcomes, but also to bring about the improvements. But then England Health Service asked me if I would take on the job of the National Patient Safety Agency to establish patient safety in all disciplines in clinical medicine, both community, primary, secondary, and tertiary care. So that's what I did. And during that time, which was a fun thing to do, was also I was asked to be a member of the Independent Peer Review Board of the Armed Forces. That was quite exciting because it allowed me to opportunity to travel all over the world to talk to armed forces as to what they think, what their pay ought to be and why, which was completely different. It was interesting exercise, interesting.
Tell me a little bit more about your patient standards and your patient safety, because I understand that you've made quite a difference in the way they do things in the UK.
Yes, it slightly went back, which was a disappointment because the present government for a while didn't seem to understand the importance of patient safety in clinical medicine. Till we got a bad report of 2 hospitals, which became a national scandal, which got published last year, and a review carried out by an independent judge who absolutely lambasted in his report the absence of patient safety, and that patient safety ought to become the central ethos of all healthcare. And that's what now has brought about the change again, that the government now wants to see patient safety in a stronger mode. But you're quite right that things like routine surgical checks, and recently I had a bit of an eye problem, and I was impressed that the senior faculty who was performing my surgery went through with the nurses and others, and the anesthesiologist, as you would call it, through the surgical safety checks. And so that's reduced what was the errors related to patient safety in surgery, but now it's also in medicine, in patient medicine's reconciliation, it's also in the hospital, the way the hospitals are run, and now we have got a legislation that patient safety is also the responsibility of the manager, who may or may not be medically qualified. And they could be charged with corporate manslaughter if, for instance, in their hospital, several deaths had occurred because of lack of patient safety.
That's a very effective way to make it work.
Correct. Correct.
During your time as an obstetrician gynecologist, you obviously had the opportunity to train and work with many young OBGYNs in the UK. What would be your advice to a young person today in the UK or in the US who was considering OBGYN as a career?
Well, first of all, I would say to them that think the advantage of doing OBGYN is really very fun specialty. It's a fun specialty partly because even though in obstetrics you might deal with women who had difficulty getting pregnant or who have difficulties during their pregnancy, you striving majority of the time to make sure that the mother and the baby is healthy at the end of it. Furthermore, you have an opportunity to change their lifestyle behavior and make it better for them. Secondly, there is so much preventative work that our specialty makes it possible for us to do to prevent diseases occurring from early, virtually childhood, to in very senior years, even past 70 and 80s. So as a specialty, it's fun specialty to do. Secondly, for those that seek academic career, there's enormous amount of research capabilities, both, and if I go back to my years when I was in Florida, we were interested in studying how to get to the fetus and how to monitor the fetus and the clinical sides and all kinds of developments. But where we failed was we never went into the biology side of it. And now isn't it interesting that today we heard in 2 lectures, we need to get to the biology of reproduction, which now opens up a completely new area of fantastic and exciting research that will make pregnancy even more safer, that hopefully will lead, and that plaque in Chicago, which is still empty for the preeclampsia cause and treatment, might well get filled because of the excitement of being able to now understand the biology of pregnancy from day 1 of conception. So that's another reason why I would say to them OBGYN. The third main reason, I think OBGYNs as individuals are much more, how shall I say, much more friendly to each other. I don't find the physician in what you call internal medicine people or surgeons behaving in the same way to their colleagues, and the collegiality of people. Now I have 2 children who are in medicine, well 3 if you include my daughter-in-law who's in infectious diseases. She's American, trained in Chicago. 1 son who is a neonatologist and a daughter who's an oncologist. And I don't find them as collegiate with their own colleagues as I find OBGYNs. So that's what I would say to them.
One of the things that you, by being in the UK and having the UK pretty much universal healthcare type of system, have been able to do has been this prevention and be able to involve in it. Now, here in the US, we are now just beginning to emerge into an affordable care system. What do you think about your system versus ours?
Well, we'll need much longer time to go through. But let me just say one thing. I subscribe to the ethos that illness isn't, when a person is ill, isn't a crime they've committed for which we should punish them. Neither it is a thing that they've done to themselves, although they may have, for which you should make them pay. But illness is something that has a community responsibility, no matter how that person acquired that illness, for which the community should pay. So if I have that ethos, then one thing I do not wish to, I would not subscribe to, is any health care in United Kingdom which says those that cannot afford it, or those that cannot pay, or those that won't change their lifestyle to make it a healthier lifestyle, to remove the burden from the state, will have to somehow be punished for that. There is a need for health care, and I think it's the responsibility of all physicians to contribute to that, to make sure that the health care you deliver is relevant, is appropriate, is affordable. That doesn't mean that you'll be stopped from prescribing expensive treatment. However, it does mean that you will not prescribe treatment that you cannot be sure of will help the patient and will help to cure their problems, or has the possibility of helping them cure their problems. And I think the two healthcare system in that respect, and the reason why I wrote that paper about establishing National Institute of Clinical Effectiveness, was to produce a guidance to the physicians to say certain treatment on evaluation isn't effective, it is costly. Now I know even in our country, in the United Kingdom, physicians rebel against the advice that the institution gives. But they have not been able to prove that that institution advice has been doing harm to the patient. Now, as you know, Ralph, because you're aware of it, I chose as my motto, for I belong to an order of knighthood called the Order of the Knight of the Thistle, which is often referred to as the ancient and noble order of Thistle. I chose as my motto for that order, primum non nocere, which is first you do no harm. So I think whether we have a healthcare system which is like yours, which is insurance-based, or when you can't afford it, it's a state-based, or like ours, which is free at the point of need, and is funded through the central taxation, it has got nothing to do with how the healthcare is funded. It's to do with how the healthcare is practiced. And I think physicians do have responsibility to make sure that healthcare you practice is affordable.
And as you know, you and I are in complete agreement on that point in terms of everything. I want to thank you for coming and sharing with you. I know
It's a pleasure.
We could continue to go for hours. I have my list of questions here, and we barely scratched the surface. Thank you very, very much on behalf of the American
It's a pleasure and to do this. But in ending, may I say that my long association with ACOG, and then my long association with you, because I remember the first time I met you, that you were introduced to me by your predecessor as the new incoming Executive Vice President. And our association has continued throughout your tenure and now subsequently. So I'm very privileged to have this association with ACOG, and I'm privileged whenever I come to these meetings, and I enjoy it. That's why I come.
Well, and you are one of our very valid members. Even though it is honorary, we look at you as a regular member of ACOG. So again, thank you.
Thank you.